Hey everyone, this is your Professor Adam Dunstan, and this is attempt number 3 on this lecture, so I'm going to get it right. I wanted to add a few additional points about the Pleistocene, which we discussed last week. Point number 1 is I'd like to actually define Pleistocene. I know it came up in the YouTube video I had you watch, but I also wanted to define it here in lecture. The Pleistocene covers 2.5 million years ago to roughly 12,000 years ago, or the time period that is popularly known as the Ice Age, because it was a relatively cool period. This is followed by the Holocene, the period we are currently in, which is a relatively warm period, in which right at the start of that warming trend is when you start to see the rise of agriculture, but that's a subject for next week. During this really long period of the Pleistocene, we have tended to assume in anthropology that because everyone was hunter-gatherers, that as a result, we could pretty much make a lot of assumptions about how people were living in the Pleistocene. They would have been in small groups, kind of these extended family bands of 50 to 100. They would have been mobile, meaning moving around the landscape to make use of different plants and animals depending on the time of year. They would have been egalitarian, meaning that there wasn't a whole lot of people, concentrating wealth. There wasn't sort of, really firm hierarchies or royalty or something. And that is what anthropologists have thought for a very long time. And indeed, if you watch my videos of even 4 or 5 years ago, that is sort of how I tend to present it. But the last 20 years, and even the last 10 years, and even the last 5 years, have really brought up a lot of evidence that starts to complicate or even contradict that point of view. So even though that has been the dominant kind of consensus view, the consensus view may be starting to shift. A good example of this is a book called The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity that came out a few years ago. It was by the late David Graeber, who, in addition to always making funny faces in most of the photos you see of him, was a really renowned anthropologist. And then David Rengo, a other really well-known anthropologist, in his case an archaeological anthropologist, who always has really excellent scarves in every photo you see of him. Anyways, those two guys wrote a book called The Dawn of Everything, and in it they said, among other things, basically our view of this ice age period has really become a lot more complicated in the last few years, the last couple of decades, based on a lot of different finds that have come out. So I just wanted to mention an example of that. In the last 20 years, we've seen about 60 different finds of what we are calling mammoth houses, although it's not 100% clear that they were actually houses. They were structures of some sort, we think. Basically, what you have is these rings of mammoth bones, and sometimes other animals mixed in as well, but these rings of mammoth bones. In one example, you clearly had it from like many, many, many different individuals of mammoths, like dozens of different mammoths. This specific site that we've got a picture of here is Kostenki, which is 20,000 years old. As you can see, there's also some other archaeological features going on there other than the mammoth bones. And these quote unquote mammoth houses are fascinating because they suggest, among other things, that you probably had really large gatherings of people, like hundreds of people gathering together to eat that much mammoth together and to, get bones from dozens and dozens of different mammoths and bring them all to one place. People either you have to have a huge population, like hundreds of people to do that quickly, or you have to have people um, accumulating it over a long time and very intentionally putting it in one place, essentially building a village. Either way, that doesn't sound like what we thought the Ice Age was supposed to look like. Not only that, but in those sites, they have things like shells that clearly traveled extremely long distances to get to where they are, because these sites are found in Russia and Ukraine. And so that suggests that there was this really long distance trade networks between these allegedly, small, isolated mobile hunter-gatherer groups. So does this mean that people weren't hunter-gatherer groups? No, I mean, clearly this is literally a hunting phenomena. It is suggesting, though, that there was potentially a lot more variety in terms of what their actual group life looked like, and that sometimes they were getting together in much larger groups and maybe making settlements that were a lot more intentional than we tend to think. So that's a point I wanted to make about the Pleistocene. There's other things too that are making our understanding of the Pleistocene continue to evolve, pun intended. One of them is a variety of different burials that we have continued to discover. Um, there's some that I actually don't have sides for, but we've found two or three different, several different burials over the last while, where you have basically huge accumulations of shell jewelry and stuff like that during the Ice Age, which is surprising in part because it's indicative of a huge amount of labor that it would take to craft these like really elaborate jewelry, and then it's being buried with these people. That suggests um, wealth accumulation, perhaps, or suggests perhaps certain people being more high status. It suggests perhaps craft people, specialized craft people, a lot of things that again kind of go against how we tend to think that the Ice Age looked. So that's interesting. Burials can also show us other kinds of things that are interesting too. What you see here to the left is the burial that is called Shanidar 1. It's a Homo neanderthalensis. Anthropologists have gone back and forth over time about whether Neanderthals should be included as a subspecies of Homo sapien or as a separate species. If we take the sort of high school biology definition of species as a group that interbreeds with each other and produces fertile offspring, then you would logically put Neanderthals as a subspecies of Homo sapiens and not a separate species, in part because you can find trace amounts of Neanderthal DNA in modern humans. So that obviously suggests that there was interbreeding going on back in the day. So, from that point of view, Neanderthals would be similar enough to humans to breed with them. But in any case, this was a Neanderthal burial. You can radiocarbon estimate of being about 50,000 years old, according to the anthropological narrative. And notable, Shanidar 1 is notable because the person here, um, we've been able to reconstruct that basically he experienced a head trauma on one part of his skull, and which would probably explain the fact that he has like certain of his features are very shriveled, smaller than you would expect. And it's proposed that he was probably partially paralyzed, probably walked with a limp, and given where his head was injured, very possibly had um, was blind as well as would have potentially had hearing issues. And that's all, not that surprising, right? People get injured, people have brain injuries that then have physical ramifications. What's surprising is that the individual that we're calling Shanidar 1 died around 40, which for Neanderthals living in the Pleistocene, that's a pretty long time period. That's sort of living to old age, or at least living to mature age. So you take an individual. Oh, and then also you can tell that the injuries had happened relatively early in life because they had started to heal over in the skeleton. So all of this suggests, if you're using your logic, you essentially have an individual that would not have most likely been able to contribute to hunting and possibly not to gathering, but who was living all the way up into his 40s. This suggests that the group as a whole was taking care of this person and provisioning food for this person. So, contrary to sort of our popular vision of sort of cave people clubbing each other over the head and not giving a hoot about each other, Shanidar 1 suggests quite the contrary, that by Neanderthal period, humans are very actively taking care of people in their society who are vulnerable, which I think is a powerful message that kind of goes against how we sometimes tend to envision this time period, and thus sort of what we think is implicit human nature. Well, if you're trying to look for implicit human nature in sort of the earliest of modern Homo sapiens, apparently they were doing a lot of things like caring for people who were disabled. Another couple of burials, Shanidar 4 and Shanidar Z, obviously from the same area, also about 50,000 years ago, also Neanderthals. They are interesting because they have very specific bodily positions, the way the bones are laid. For example, this one, it makes it look like the person was laid to rest in their grave with their, like, I'm trying to do a motion, but my camera's not on. But anyways, with their head resting against their hand. And then there's sort of like different kinds of soil, for lack of a better word, that are on top of it that show that the soil was just placed and then put on top of it. So clearly they were like buried. They didn't just like die and then a bunch of soil accumulated on them. It's obvious that soil was placed on top of them. So it was a burial. But then there's also flower petals, and that could have happened naturally, obviously. Certainly that's possible that just this person dies and then randomly a bunch of flower petals land. What is most anthropologists tend to think is that this was probably intentional. And if it was intentional, that is interesting because there's no sort of practical reason to put flowers on a grave, right? What it does suggest is obviously emotional attachment and mourning. It also potentially suggests some kind of symbolic behavior. Some anthropologists go so far as to suggest that this is sort of some of our earliest signs of religious ritual. Um, I personally think that that is way overstretching the evidence. I don't think that that is at all a reasonable presumption, that that's what that means, that there was flower petals, in part because plenty of people do funeral ceremonies that don't have any sort of religious component to it. So the logic to me doesn't really hold up. But nonetheless, it is clearly humans engaging in sort of modern artistic symbolic behavior as part of mourning. So that's interesting. So again, it's not just sort of cave people sitting around grunting at each other and only ever thinking about hunting. Now, lest you think that my picture of the Ice Age is sort of, everybody was taking care of each other and, flowers and all that. Um, that's not to suggest that there wasn't violence as well, of course. So this is the Otzi, is what, or sometimes called the Iceman or the Tyolian Iceman. It's a site from 3300 BC, and he was what we call like a natural mummy, by which we mean that he was preserved in such a way in the cold weather conditions where essentially his body mummified without having to actually have somebody intentionally mummify them. Anyways, Otzi has an arrow in one of his shoulders, and there's been considerable discussion about what this means. After all, somebody could just have an arrow injury from like a hunting injury, right? This could just be a hunting party gone wrong. But other anthropologists have felt that maybe this was more intentional. And even Steven Pinker, who's a well-known author, has used this to argue that humans used to be much more violent. Um, as he puts it, he's got a quote where he basically says, why is it that the ancients can never leave us a skeleton without there being violence? That's kind of nonsense. That's actually not a good conclusion at all. We have lots and lots of burials where it's the person did not die of violence. But Otzi is interesting. It's interesting to think about sort of under what conditions one ancient human was killing another ancient human on top of a really, really cold mountain. So again, not to, this is all to say that, we're not suggesting some sort of utopia here. Now, this isn't actually the Pleistocene, I should clarify. So I called it what was the Pleistocene in here. That was not right. I should instead call it early Holocene, because this is more recent than that. But anyways, what I'm trying to point out though, although it's not technically the Pleistocene, is that in hunter-gatherer Europe, which is where a lot of these burials come from, was not clearly some utopia where people never hurt each other. Otzi is a good example of clearly something happened. All right, that is what I wanted to say, generally speaking, about. Oh, and one more thing. Well, yeah, as we get towards the end of the Pleistocene, we start to see even richer examples of human beings engaging in really clear examples of symbolic behavior. And one of our most famous examples of this that you've probably heard of and probably seen in textbooks, whether or not you know it's called this, is the Lascaux Caves from France, where you have numerous different paintings of animals, including aurochs, the ancestors of modern cattle. And so these are interesting. Cave paintings are often interpreted as religious artwork by anthropologists. I'm a bit of a skeptic on that one as well. You're going to get the impression that I'm often skeptical of these sorts of things. I just think it's a bit of a leap. After all, people sometimes just like drawing things. But it is very interesting that humans are clearly engaging in this very highly symbolic, semi-realistic, in some cases very realistic artwork by this time period. The other thing I wanted to mention before we left this topic of sort of the Pleistocene was a few additional thoughts about what hominid biology was having go on during this time period. And I want to share this partly because it's important information for you to understand if you're to understand sort of the anthropological consensus on hominid biology and evolution, but also because it's a really good example of sort of, again, much like with Pleistocene social conditions, Pleistocene biological conditions show us sort of how science changes its understanding over time. So this blue bar down here is what we sometimes call, well, what we do call Homo sapiens. And you could further divide it up into kind of like an archaic time period and then like sort of truly modern, anatomically modern Homo sapiens. But anyways, generally speaking, this 300,000 years to present, that's what KYA means, is thousands of years ago. Um, but we used to think that during this time period, right? So you see a ton of different species here. We used to think that the way anthropologists used to think of hominid evolution was that there's essentially a very, very straightforward progression through stages, eventually leading to Homo sapien, starting with apes, of going through ape-like primates, going through Neanderthal, going through Cro-Magnon, and then modern man. And that was the idea. And even as we started to find more and more species, we still tended to fit them into kind of a linear progression. So, for example, in the 1960s, generally speaking, anthropologists are still thinking of it as sort of Australopithecus. Um, 5 to 3 million years ago, we're starting to get bipedalism and a little bit of tool using, perhaps not tool crafting, but that led into Homo habilis, our first truly bipedal, fully bipedal, um, in the way that it looks now, Homo erectus, and then sort of Neanderthals and sapiens. Again, sort of this right? We're going down the chain. This becomes this, becomes this, becomes this, which is how people oftentimes think of evolution. But if you think of the basics of evolutionary theory, of course, we understand that in lots of animals, there's branches, but it was with human beings, we were tending to think of it as like this becomes this one thing, becomes this one thing, becomes this one thing. And then that's where you get images like this. In the 1970s, as my really high-tech GIF here, GIF, GIF. I'm being told by my advisor that it's a GIF. Anyways, as my GIF here shows, the 1970s was sort of an explosion of discoveries of hominid fossils that really, really caused anthropologists to have to reevaluate how we thought about things. So the 1970s, this is sort of the 60s, 70s, 80s. This is kind of the heyday of some of the early research by the Leakeys, which are a very famous physical anthropology family, multi-generational family of physical anthropologists working in East Africa. But anyways, during the 1970s, during that heyday, you had several different skull finds. KNM-ER 1470, or Homo rudolfensis is what we sometimes call it, which had these very ape-like bodily features apparently, but then really large brain, and lived about 2 million years ago. Then you have KNM-ER 1813, or Homo habilis, which in many ways looks like Homo, right? Like looks like modern humans, but have very small brain. And then also this guy over here, who we think is maybe Homo erectus, yet another Homo erectus, but maybe a new thing called Homo ergaster, because it's like smaller than it should be if it's Homo erectus. And you're saying like, so what? Who cares? Well, part of what this is showing us is that there are way more hominid species than we think. So from like the 1970s to the early 2000s, you essentially double the number of hominid species which anthropologists perceive as existing. Now, that does get us into the lumper splitter problem that we've already discussed of sort, and I tend to be much more of a lumper, by which I mean I'm skeptical of new claims that, oh, I've discovered a new species, partly because I know professors, and I think sometimes we get a little high on our own supply, as they say, a little excited about our new discovery, really wanting it to be something special. But also I'm a cultural anthropologist. I really shouldn't even have an opinion here. I'm not a physical anthropologist. But whether you're a lumper or a splitter, the point is the 70s through the 90s saw lots and lots of new finds that clearly showed that hominids were far more diverse physically and genetically than we had anticipated. And you had things like a new find that we call, or was called at the time, Kenyanthropus. You can probably guess where that was found. It was found in Kenya, coexisting at the same time period as Australopithecus afarensis, or the famous, quote, Lucy skeleton. So finds like that caused us to realize that it was not linear progression of one to one to one to one, that instead there was multiple different hominid species that were apparently living at the same time period. As is brought up in that book I referenced a minute ago, we really cannot properly conceptualize what this would have been like, right? How diverse human-like organisms were at the time, because we have literally nothing to compare that to, right? So at the time, there's huge amounts of biological diversity going on, according to the skeletal evidence. Although again, during this early time period, what we're calling hominids are still, if you were to see them, something like an Anthropus, something like Australopithecus, you would be much more inclined to put it in the category of ape versus human if you had to make a decision. We also see signs of even earlier stone technology that we've discovered uh, correlated with Kenyanthropus, which we call Loniquian. It's a bit of a hard one. Anyways, there was also a lot more genetic research being done in the 70s through the 90s, all of which leads us to, by the 2000s, anthropologists have really abandoned this idea of sort of a linear progression of just one to one to one to one. And instead, now we have what we sometimes call the family shrub model as opposed to the family tree, just because we like to be clever, but also because it's like more complicated than a family tree, where essentially what this is telling us, there's different ways of grouping these geni, genuses or geni, but however you group it, basically what we're learning here is that you have multiple species that were coexisting at the same time, and you have sort of what we might call evolutionary dead ends, which is a little insulting to the species that belong to the dead ends. But anyways, you have things that never actually went and became part of the Homo line, but instead were their own line, like Paranthropus, which is this more ape-like organism. And then eventually, by sort of the 2010s, we're starting to hear people talk a lot more about braided streams model, especially as genetic research has progressed. So basically, there's a lot of different reasons to think this, but one of them is just basic DNA. You can find DNA in modern humans that matches. You can find trace amounts of Neanderthal DNA. It's not like that's the majority. We don't have like Neanderthals wandering around, but you have like the type of DNA that you have in a Neanderthal bone. And then humans, particularly in Europe, will have like trace amounts of it. Same thing with Denisovians, which are a more recent find. They're similar to Neanderthals in a lot of ways, but anyways, Denisovian DNA, you can find trace amounts of it in certain Southeast Asian populations. So what all of this suggests is not only were a lot of different hominid species coexisting at the same time, in this case, sapien with Neanderthalis, for example, but also that they were interbreeding and having children with each other, which again calls into question whether or not we should even consider them separate species. And there has been a tendency over time to start to call all of this sort of just human or archaic Homo. So we call it braided streams because the idea is it's sort of like rivers that are coming and intersecting with each other and sometimes branching off and becoming things that sort of just become a dead end, like Homo florensis, which is from this tiny little island down in Southeast Asia where these ancient skeletons that look a lot like a modern Homo sapien, but extremely small. But anyways, generally speaking, though, the idea is that a lot of these groups had DNA that eventually contributed to the main line of development into Homo sapiens. That's how physical anthropologists understand it now. How will they understand it 50 years from now? Tough to say, right? We are trying to piece together a whole lot of history from what is still, despite amazing finds over the last 30 years, still an incredibly small amount of fossil evidence that we're trying to use. So probably our understandings will continue to evolve.